The pre-dawn haze along the Shabelle River hung thick and wet, turning the world into shades of gray and black. Muzzle flashes punched through the murk like angry fireflies, and the crack of incoming rounds stitched patterns in the mud that came closer with each burst. The Joint Advisory Team, 3 American NCOs and a handful of Somali commandos, had been caught in a textbook L-shaped ambush, pinned against the riverbank with nowhere to go but into the water or into the ground. Sergeant First Class Morrison pressed himself flat behind a termite mound that was disintegrating under sustained fire, trying to make himself smaller than physics allowed. Blood ran warm down his left arm from a fragment wound, mixing with the river mud caked on his sleeve. 20 meters to his right, their team leader was screaming into a radio handset, "Try to raise anyone." The quick reaction force, the mortar pit, even the goddamn Air Force. But the antenna had been shot clean off in the first volley, leaving them with nothing but static and their own heavy breathing. "Overwatch, this is ground. Come in," the team leader shouted again, his voice cracking with something between anger and panic. Nothing. Just the hiss of dead air and the heavier thump of a technical truck's heavy machine gun somewhere in the tree line, walking fire methodically down their position. Morrison spat mud and blood, his voice bitter even through the pain. "It's over. She's gone dark. Probably got hit in the first 30 seconds. He didn't say her name, didn't need to. Everyone knew who he meant. The token female sniper they'd been saddled with for this operation. The one who was supposed to be their guardian angel from across the river. The one Morrison had spent the last week making jokes about in the team room, calling her a diversity hire, a political move, someone's idea of good optics rather than good soldiering. The irony was thick enough to taste, metallic like the blood in his mouth. The same woman he dismissed with a wave of his hand during the mission brief. "We don't need her input. We've done this 100 times," was now their only realistic hope of getting out of this kill zone alive. And if Morrison's assessment was right, if she really had been taken out in the opening seconds, then they were well and truly fucked. The narrator's voice would note, if this were a film, the contrast between the chaos along that muddy riverbank, the shouting, the panic, the half-baked suggestions being thrown around by men who suddenly realized their bravado meant nothing against bullets, and the unseen stillness somewhere beyond the river's edge, where the real center of gravity quietly waited. 1 week earlier, the same riverbank had been peaceful, almost beautiful in the golden hour before sunset. But the forward operating base near Mogadishu, where the team was staged, held no such beauty, just HESCO barriers, generator noise, and the perpetual dust that got into everything. She had arrived on a supply helicopter, stepping off the ramp with a nondescript duffel bag and an old rifle case that had seen better days. Staff Sergeant Elena Reyes didn't look like much, 5'4", maybe 120 soaking wet, with her dark hair pulled back tight and an expression that gave away nothing. She wore a faded unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment that most people didn't look at closely enough to read, and when the liaison officer introduced her at the briefing table with a single line, "This is your Overwatch element for the Shabelle operation," the reaction in the room was immediate and unspoken. Morrison had exchanged glances with the others, the kind of look that said everything without words. Another box to check, another concession to politics playing out in the real world where it didn't belong. He'd seen her type before, or thought he had. People who got slots they hadn't really earned, riding coattails of policy changes rather than proven performance. What Morrison didn't know, what none of them bothered to find out, was that Elena Reyes had more combat deployments than the rest of the team combined. Iraq in 2016, embedded with Iraqi special forces during the brutal street-by-street clearing of Mosul. Syria in 2018 and 2019, supporting Kurdish and Arab fighters in the final push against ISIS around Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. She had a Bronze Star with V device for valor, earned during a night operation outside Raqqa when her high position was discovered and she'd held off a counterattack long enough for her team to extract, using nothing but her sidearm and a knife after her rifle took a round through the scope. There were names on a memorial wall at Fort Benning that she visited every time she passed through, teammates who hadn't made a home, men who'd called her Wraith, because of her ability to disappear into terrain and emerge exactly where she needed to be, exactly when it mattered most. She'd spent 72 consecutive hours in a high position on a Mosul rooftop, motionless except to take water and handle bodily functions, waiting for one specific high-value target to show himself. When he finally did, one shot at 847 meters had ended a siege and saved an entire company of Iraqi soldiers who'd been pinned in a kill zone not unlike the one Morrison would find himself in a week later. But the new team didn't ask about any of that. To them, she was just the girl with a rifle, a political statement in BDUs, someone to be tolerated rather than trusted. The contrast was sharp, painful even to observe. To the men in that briefing room, Elena Reyes was an inconvenience, possibly a liability. To anyone who'd actually worked with her, who'd seen her work, she was one of the most dangerous individuals they'd ever encounter. Precise, patient, and utterly unshakable under pressure. The days leading up to the mission had been a slow-building study in frustration, each small interaction adding another layer to the disconnect between perception and reality. On the range 2 days before the operation, Morrison had set up an impromptu shooting competition, the way infantry guys do when there's downtime and ammunition to burn. Targets at 300, 500, and 800 meters, shooting from various positions, with running commentary and the usual shit-talking that accompanied such events. Reyes had gone last, waiting quietly while the others took their turns. When her turn came, she didn't say a word, just settled into position, controlled her breathing, and began sending rounds downrange. At 300 meters, her group could have been covered by a quarter. At 500, she called a wind correction to herself, half-minute right, and adjusted accordingly, punching another tight cluster. At 800, she took her time, reading the mirage, feeling for the wind against her face, and squeezed off 5 rounds that landed within a handspan of each other. Morrison, watching through a spotting scope, had felt something uncomfortable twist in his gut. That wasn't luck. That was skill built over thousands of rounds and hundreds of hours. But admitting that would mean admitting he'd been wrong, so instead he'd laughed it off. "Must be nice when the gun does all the work for you," he'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear. These new rifles practically shoot themselves. It was a weak deflection, and everyone knew it, but no one challenged him. The moment passed, and Reyes just cleaned her rifle and packed her gear without comment. During the final mission rehearsal, gathered around a sand table built from local dirt and satellite imagery printouts, Reyes had leaned forward and quietly pointed out a choke point along the planned route. "This section here," she'd said, her finger tracing the riverbank, "it's a natural ambush site." The 2017 Maritime Interdiction Report noted that local militants used this exact terrain for an attack on a UN logistics convoy. "I'd recommend we adjust our approach, come in from the south instead." The team leader had glanced at the map, then at his watch, then back at Morrison, who'd rolled his eyes dramatically. "We've done this 100 times, Morrison had said. "Different river, same basic setup. We stick to the plan, stay on schedule, and we'll be fine." The team leader had nodded, grateful for an excuse not to complicate things further or push back their timeline. "Agreed. We proceed as briefed." Reyes had sat back without another word, her face neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she was filing that decision away for future reference. In the team room that night, Morrison had held court as usual, entertaining the others with stories and speculation. "You know why she's really here, right?" he'd said, his voice carrying across the plywood partitions. "Some colonel in D.C. needs to show he's progressive, so they send us a girl with a rifle to make the slide deck look good. Doesn't matter if she can actually do the job, as long as someone can take a photo for the diversity brochure." The others had laughed, uncomfortable but unwilling to dissent, while 20 feet away Reyes had sat on her cot, methodically cleaning her rifle, apparently oblivious to the commentary. But a careful observer might have noticed small details that told a different story. The tattoo on her inner forearm, partially visible when she reached for a cleaning rod, showing the crest from the Special Operations Target Interdiction Course, one of the military's most selective sniper schools. The carefully folded photograph tucked into her kit, a team photo from Syria, with several faces circled in black marker, the universal symbol of fallen teammates. The way she'd flinched just slightly when someone had test-fired the .50 caliber machine gun outside, a reaction that suggested she'd been on the receiving end of that distinctive sound more times than she cared to remember. These were the signatures of someone who'd been in the shit, who'd done the work, who carried the weight of real combat experience. But Morrison and the others weren't looking for those signs because they'd already decided what they wanted to see. The frustration built like pressure behind a dam. Scene after scene of competence ignored, expertise dismissed, warnings unheeded. The viewer, if this were a film, would feel it accumulating, knowing with sick certainty where it was all leading, watching a preventable disaster unfold in slow motion, because ego and groupthink had blinded smart men to obvious truth. The night of the mission arrived with no moon and heavy cloud cover, which was good for concealment, but hell for visibility. The team loaded into rigid-hull inflatable boats, engines barely above a whisper, and began the slow journey upriver toward the link-up point. Reyes had rolled off the side of the lead boat without fanfare. Her rifle sealed in a waterproof bag, her gear weighted and balanced for a submerged approach. The plan, as briefed, had her swimming to a hide position on the east bank, providing overwatch while the team met with a local source in a riverside village. It was a sound plan on paper, though not quite the plan Reyes would have chosen if anyone had asked her opinion beyond the initial briefing. As she'd predicted, as she tried to warn them about, they were walking straight into prepared ground. The signs were there for anyone trained to read them. A village that should have had cook fires but showed none, a fishing boat that should have been moored but wasn't, dogs that had been barking earlier in the evening but had gone silent in the last 30 minutes. Small details, easy to miss if you weren't looking, impossible to ignore if you'd learned the hard way what they meant. Morrison, crouched in the second boat with his rifle across his knees, had felt uneasy but couldn't articulate why. The team leader had pushed forward, committed to the timeline, trusting in repetition and routine to carry them through. The ambush detonated with devastating precision. 2 IEDs went off simultaneously. Command detonated from somewhere in the darkness, throwing mud and shrapnel in overlapping kill zones. Before the echo faded, automatic weapons fire erupted from the tree line. An L-shaped ambush, textbook execution, with interlocking fields of fire that pinned the team against the riverbank with nowhere to maneuver. The radio antenna was hit in the first volley, a piece of shrapnel or a well-aimed bullet cutting their link to the quick reaction force and the mortar pit. The Somali commandos scattered, some diving for cover, others running back toward the boats in panic. Morrison took a fragment to the arm and went down cursing, his rifle flying into the mud. And then came the heavy machine gun, the distinctive thump of a technical truck's .50 caliber or 12.7 millimeters weapon, firing from somewhere in the darkness and walking tracers down toward their position with methodical precision. Overwatch, this is ground, come in. The team leader's voice held an edge of desperation, calling for the guardian angel they dismissed and disrespected, hoping she was out there somewhere, hoping she hadn't been hit. Nothing, just static and the growing certainty that they were on their own. She's gone, Morrison had gasped, the words bitter with pain and irony. It's over. But 400 meters downriver, in a high position she'd established during her swim. Not where the plan said she'd be, but where the terrain and threat assessment told her she needed to be, Staff Sergeant Elena Reyes was very much alive and very much working. She'd taken the longer route, the one she tried to suggest in the briefing, swimming downriver with the current before cutting across to the east bank. It had cost her an extra 40 minutes and left her exhausted, but it had put her in a position with cross-angle observation of the likely enemy firing points. And then she'd waited, buried in reeds and mud, breathing through her nose, listening to the night, patient as stone. When the ambush kicked off, she'd counted to 10, slow and steady, letting the chaos develop, mapping muzzle flashes and identifying priorities. The heavy machine gun was the immediate threat, so it went first. Her rifle came up smooth and sure, scope picture clear, even in the low light thanks to night vision mounted offset. The gunner on the technical was illuminated by his own muzzle flash, making him easy to acquire. Reyes controlled her breathing, found the natural pause between heartbeats, and pressed the trigger. 823 meters. The gunner dropped. The spotter beside him, realizing something was wrong, tried to swing the gun around to search for the threat. Reyes cycled the bolt, reacquired, fired. The spotter went down before he could complete the traverse. And then, with the calm professionalism of someone who'd done this more times than she could count, Reyes began systematically dismantling the ambush. Leaders first, she could identify them by their position and the way others oriented on them. Then the RPG teams, the ones preparing to finish what the machine gun had started. Then anyone trying to maneuver on the flanks, anyone trying to organize a rush on the pinned Americans. Over the damaged radio, using the team's alternate frequency that only the team leader would think to check, her voice came through calm and level. "Ground, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on. Shifting fire to your north. Stand by for mortar call." Morrison, bleeding and half buried in mud, heard that voice and couldn't process it. She was alive? She was working? The team leader, scrambling for the backup handset, recognized her call sign, and something clicked in his memory. A service record he'd barely skimmed, a name mentioned in passing by someone at group headquarters. "That's the same sniper who pulled that unit out of Raqqa," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Morrison's face went through a rapid series of changes. Disbelief, confusion, and then something like shame as understanding dawned. The woman he'd called a diversity hire, the operator he'd dismissed as a political checkbox, was now the only thing standing between his team and annihilation. Reyes continued working with mechanical efficiency. She'd quietly coordinated with a partner mortar unit during the planning phase, a just-in-case contingency that she'd arranged without fanfare or credit-seeking. Now she called the fire mission, adjusted based on observed impacts, and walked high-explosive rounds into the tree line with devastating accuracy. The militants, caught between precision rifle fire from an unexpected angle and mortar impacts that seemed to know exactly where they were, began to break contact. Some tried to rally, to organize a withdrawal, but Reyes kept pressure on them, forcing them to abandon equipment and casualties as they melted back into the darkness. 20 minutes after it started, the riverbank fell silent except for labored breathing and the distant thump of retreating vehicles. The ambush was broken. The team was alive. No one had anything to say about diversity hires anymore. Back at the forward operating base 36 hours later, the mood in the team room had changed fundamentally. The usual bravado was gone, drained away by the proximity of death and the uncomfortable recognition of how close arrogance had brought them to disaster. Elena Reyes sat alone at a corner bench, methodically field stripping her rifle, rinsing river mud from the action with careful precision. Each part was cleaned, inspected, and treated with the same quiet care she brought to everything else. No wasted motion, no commentary, just professional maintenance by someone who understood that equipment care was the difference between life and death. One by one, the same men who joked about her, who dismissed her input and questioned her presence, filed past with awkward offerings. A cup of coffee, still hot, set down beside her without words. A wordless nod that carried more weight than speeches. A spot saved at the table for the evening meal. A small gesture that meant inclusion rather than tolerance. Morrison came last, his arm bandaged, and his usual swagger replaced by something more genuine. He stood there for a long moment, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow or self-serving, before finally managing, "We owe you." Reyes looked up from her work, her dark eyes unreadable, and offered a response that cut through any attempt to hero worship or personal credit. "We owe the ones who didn't come back." Then she returned to her rifle, to the careful work of maintenance and preparation, because there would be other missions, other teams, other moments where quiet competence would matter more than volume or appearance. The military, like any large organization, is held together by different types of people. There are the loud voices, the ones who dominate briefings and command attention in any room. They have their place and their value. Leadership often requires the ability to project confidence and make decisive calls. But underneath that surface layer, in the quiet spaces between operations, the institution runs on a different currency. The professionals who do the work without needing recognition, who prepare for contingencies no one wants to consider, who stay focused when everything goes to hell. Elena Reyes represented that second category, the quiet professionals whose competence only becomes visible when everything else fails. She didn't ask for respect or demand recognition. She simply did the work, maintained her standards, and let her actions speak when words had already failed. The lesson, if there was one to extract from that week along the Shabelle River, wasn't about gender or diversity or political correctness. It was about the fundamental human tendency to judge by surface appearance rather than demonstrated capability, to let bias and assumption override evidence and expertise. Morrison and his team had looked at Elena Reyes and seen what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. They'd let prejudice, subtle and unexamined, cloud their judgment and nearly cost them everything. In the end, she'd save them not because she wanted to prove them wrong or make a point about women in combat or any other ideological statement. She'd save them because that was her job, because she was a professional, and because when the moment came, she was exactly where she needed to be with exactly the skills required. The fact that she'd been right about the route, right about the ambush site, right about the contingency planning, all of that was secondary to the simple reality that she'd done her job while others had failed to do theirs. The story would close there, with the team room settling into a new normal, with maintenance and preparation and the mundane work of military life continuing. No dramatic speeches, no formal apologies, just a quiet acknowledgement that assumptions had been wrong and that respect, once truly earned, didn't need to be asked for. And perhaps, in the spirit of stories shared and lessons learned, the viewer might be invited to consider their own moments of being underestimated, their own experiences of having to prove capability the hard way, because someone else's assumptions had closed doors that merit should have opened. Because while the specific details might belong to that riverbank in Somalia, the underlying pattern, competence dismissed, expertise ignored, judgment clouded by bias, plays out in countless contexts, in ways both dramatic and subtle, whenever we let surface impression override deeper truth.